Hello and welcome to Asia in Depth. I'm Michelle Florcruz. Chinese-American author Amy Tan is best known for her critically acclaimed The Joy Luck Club, a novel that examines the lives of 4 Chinese immigrant families in San Francisco. In 1993, Tan adapted the novel into a groundbreaking movie, the first Hollywood-produced film featuring an all-Asian American and predominantly female cast. Throughout her career, Tan has channeled immense personal challenges into her writing, including profound family loss, conflicting cultural expectations, and a strained relationship with her mother. She recently shared her life story in the 2021 documentary, Amy Tan: Unintended Memoir. Through archival videos, personal photographs, and original interviews, the film weaves together a vivid portrait of the prolific and celebrated figure in American literature. In a recent conversation as part of the Asia Society at the Movies film series, Tan explores the themes of the documentary, her painful past, and her successful career. She speaks with Orville Schell, Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at Asia Society, who begins the conversation.
And Amy, I wanted to just start off by asking you, as a child, I mean, I actually met your mother, but as a child, what did you think of China as sort of refracted through her? Did you want to go there? I mean, that was the time, wasn't it, when we were pretty much divided? But tell us how you came to view that as a young woman.
Well, my parents didn't really talk about China that much, except in part, I think, because back then it was known as Red China. And I think there was a level of fear among people who might say anything. So what we heard about was Formosa, for example. And I knew so very little about China because, well, I grew up in an era where history consisted of Western civilization. And that somehow didn't include China. So China was not a place that I thought very much of, and certainly wasn't something a place I'd want to go to because of its stigmatized presence in our family's life.
And yet here you are on video, whatever we're on here, a virtual conversation, and you have a lovely Changming saw around your neck.
Oh, yeah.
So
yes.
You've sort of adopted some of the cultural affectations of that world, which in youth was sort of vanished over the horizon, right?
Yes. Well, this one actually is something that I got from my mother's boyfriend when we took them to China, to Shandong province. And as a gift, he gave me this thing here. So it's one of my favorite pieces that, I think a lot of these things have become very personal to me. Whether it is something like a necklace or some kind of decoration or books, that all of these things have become personal to my life, and understanding that these things, China and the personal history of my parents within the history of China has shaped me a great deal.
I mean, your mother was not an easy mother.
No.
How would you describe her? I mean, if you had to do a Tiger Mom kind of an appellation, what would you say about her?
Oh, dragons are far more powerful than tigers, for one thing. She was a fire dragon. I'm a water dragon. And she was somebody who was, first of all, I have to say my mother was one of the most honest people I know, to the point that she was also a little bit too forthcoming. She would tell you, a stranger, if their hair was not looking very good. She also was genuinely caring of people, very, very kind. She could tell also if somebody was a genuine person or whether they were fake and simply acting nice. But she was also somebody who was living a life of trauma because of her mother having killed herself. Her mother became a widow when my mother was 2. They had to go live with a very cheapskate brother. Her mother eventually became a concubine, and the history about that is a little unclear. And then her mother killed herself. Her mother had a very strong temper, and that is something my mother inherited as well. My mother inherited also her tendency, my grandmother's suicidal tendencies, and had threatened and attempted to kill herself numerous times, both my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother succeeded.
But you ultimately did, I think, quite miraculously, and I think that's what's so interesting about this film, that your mother, was she perhaps not very explainable when you were young, and yet you somehow, with great tenacity, stuck with the sort of the excavation to kind of figure her out. But when you were, let's say, up to 15 years old, did you think she was rather mysterious? Did she share her past history with you, or was this something that came later?
She wasn't mysterious at all. I didn't realize she had mystery in her until I was much older. And I just took what she presented as who she was. And so there were a lot of stories she told, but she didn't give the backdrop of what really happened. She would talk about warnings and say that that bad man would, take me away, or if I did this, something terrible would happen. One of them being that she would die. She, when I didn't obey her, or I didn't practice the piano with a great deal of enthusiasm, she'd say, "Oh, why listen to me? Soon I dead anyway. Go play outside instead of playing the piano." And then, I'd freak out as a kid, and I knew what death meant because I had actually seen my playmate from down the street at, a funeral parlor. My mother took me there, I think in part as a warning of bad things that could happen to me if I didn't listen to her. She claimed that my friend died because she didn't wash her fruit. So my mother, she had ways of hinting to her history, her life, through those kinds of warnings. And later, when I was in my 20s and 30s, she started to tell me things. Once I learned that she had daughters that she had left behind in China. And when I started in my 30s to write stories, then she really poured out these things. But, before then, I never wanted to listen, because all of her stories came in the form of a lament, very long, 3-hour lament. And, it'd be, "You've told me this, 100 times." And then she claimed I didn't need to hear her anymore, so she'd kill herself. So that was the nature of
that's a
how I remember the relationship from, when I was younger in those days. Yeah.
But at what age was it when you finally began to say, there's more here than I imagined? I can see now, a whole other universe opening up behind her passage across the Pacific. What age would you say that you were?
There was not one particular age in which I suddenly had transformed my interest into learning more about who she was. For example, when I was in my 20s, well, let me go back. When I was an adolescent, I was very ashamed of being Chinese. Like a lot of people who of that period who were born in this country and didn't know a lot of other Asian kids in school, and got teased or taunted for being Chinese. But when I was in my 20s, I became interested in a sort of activism in being Asian. Asian, in fact, being that umbrella, Asian American being that umbrella, not just Chinese, but Asian is the collective activism. And then later, even later after that, having these series of moments like my mother, fearing that my mother was going to die, and then wanting to know a lot more about who she was before it was too late. But But it really was when I started writing fiction in my 30s. I would say I started at 35, that I found these stories always veering toward this relationship that I had with my mother. In part because when you write fiction, you have to set up a story with a situation, with some kind of tension. And I had plenty of experience with tension. I could just bring in some emotional memory that didn't have to be an exact memory, just the emotions behind it. And I'd start to write, and I realized what I was doing was writing about this relationship. And it was so revealing to me, not only about who she was, but who I was, that I became just passionate about writing this fiction, and knowing that I would never stop writing, because I was discovering so much, what I would call in general the meaning of my life.
Do you think in a way, many kids do have a rather unbridgeable break with their parents at some point when things get too difficult or too inexplicable. Do you think your writing helped you both plumb her sort of the reality of her and keep you together? Because you did stay quite closely involved with her.
I did. I started writing these stories after I believed at one point, very briefly, that she had died. And I had this tremendous sorrow or regret and fear that I had lost her and never had asked her anything about it. I never wanted to understand her. And when I discovered she was still alive, I thought, well, I've been given this opportunity. Plus, I had made this rather hasty promise to the gods that be, that if she lived, I would take her to China and I'd get to know everything about her. And so now I had to do that. But then it was wonderful. I went to China for the first time. And that also spurred me to want to know about her history in China, and as well about Chinese history, or things that were going on during a period in China, and how our family was affected by that. What were the social norms, the social customs, the hierarchies that had influenced my family, and also maybe propelled my grandmother to kill herself. I was, once I started writing, the reason why I became more immersed in this and in my mother's life is that she found for the first time, I could see it in her eyes, that somebody cared. Somebody wanted to know the miseries of her life. She had a witness finally. And I was the person who was sitting there saying, tell me more. Tell me what it was like. Everything from what you ate when you went to what you bought when you went to the market, to what was it like holding your son in your arms as he was dying. And, listening to her and crying together was cathartic for both of us.
Interestingly, Amy, I have of my acquaintance maybe 4 or 5 women, Chinese women, or quasi-Chinese American, some Chinese, some really Chinese American, and all of them have a very fraught relationship with their mother. And I'm always wondered whether this didn't have something to do with having to live across the divide. But also, in one case, using your example, I've encouraged the person to go and interview her mother, ask her about her life and record it. Say, I want to know for my kids, the future. Do you think this is kind of a good therapy? I mean, particularly for maybe people who are immigrants, but for anybody, to sort of bridge the gap between parent and child?
Absolutely. I think that the real danger is not doing it in time. I think that people should do that with their grandparents or any of their relatives of an older generation before it's too late. And it's not simply to get a history, it's to get intention and motivation to understand that and how that drove their own family and the choices that they made or the choices that they didn't have. I found, I was actually working on a project with a youth organization called 824. And it was a book that was consisted of interviews that these kids, I think high school kids, had made, asking either a grandfather, a parent, or an uncle, depending on who was available, to tell them about their life leading up to the events of their coming to the United States. And these kids had never asked, and they were finding out things like that their father had run through the fields in Cambodia and stepped on something really awful and finding out it was a head of somebody. They were in the killing fields, or somebody's parents who were in a truck and almost suffocated to death. They'd come over the border in a truck. Things that were quite dramatic. Now, if people are going to risk their lives to come to the United States like that or to escape, it's affected their life and how they then deal with their family. It's not the question of simply how do you raise your child. It has to do with survival. How is your child going to survive based on what you know about what can happen, about these dangers? And so I think that probably, in my mind, I think the families that have the most, the greatest divide may be those who have the greatest trauma or the most number of secrets in the background. When parents warn you about things and you have no idea why they're being so negative or fearful, you just want to dismiss the whole thing. But when you hear their stories, you're just so taken by saying, wow, you could have died. I wouldn't be here. You could have died. And I think that's where it begins, is to unveil those secrets, to talk about the reasons why they left, but especially just by talking about the secrets, the things that are left behind in the country, they would get a great deal more understanding of why their parents are the way they are.
And do you think your mother, if you hadn't sort of gotten around to this or hadn't been a writer, do you think perhaps you never would have sort of been able to open the door into this other room that ultimately turned out to be a kind of a vast estate of interesting experiences?
I love that metaphor, opening the door and seeing this. I have this dream every now and then that I'm living in this house and it's kind of small. And then I suddenly see this tiny little door, I think it's a cellar or something, and I open it and there's like a palace behind there.
Yeah.
And all these rooms, and they're kind of old and they need paint done to them. But that is the feeling, what you talked about and what you just said, opening up this door and finding, there's so much there that I can go and explore and make part of my life.
Don't you think it's particularly unique for the immigrant experience, because many immigrants are trying to become part of the culture in which they've arrived, and they don't really want to inflict on their kids the old world from which they obviously had some reason to flee.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes some parents don't want their kids to know. It was some of the history is also shameful. Having had grandmother or whoever had an abusive, relationship in the past, may have led them to conceal that. And so I think that once kids or adult children become aware of that, we don't have the stigma. We're here. It's like, oh, we understand what it's like to be, how terrible it would be to be forced into a marriage. We don't suffer that stigma. We don't suffer the stigma that our grandmother might have been a concubine. And so we can talk about it freely, but that's also part of it, is we don't understand necessarily what it meant at the time that it happened. And so there's all that room to explore all of those things and to try and understand. I think it's the desire to understand that is the big, big room that you've just walked into.
But, I wonder, here's something I do wonder about. I mean, I think Americans in their babbling way can be very self-confessional, right? There's a kind of a...
yes.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a kind of a presumption that you should just let it all hang out. You should be honest, on the other hand, and I was married to a Chinese woman, I think there is much more restraint and a kind of a desire to keep decorum in a Chinese Confucian culture. And I'm wondering how that occurs to you, and if whether that you think played into your family life too, and how much of that you have in your life, in yourself.
Yeah. I when you were saying that, I was just thinking about years ago, this talk about how different Chinese literature was, because it wasn't the same as these American confessional type of stories. You didn't tell everything. Although I think it was it Wang Anyi who was hailed as somebody who included more of a personal account in her fiction. Some that were starting to do that. What's different, however, in my family is that my mother, I describe her as having no buffers. So she would just go talk about confessional. She would talk about everything. And if you saw the film, you'd see she even talked about her sex life. Mm-hmm. She wanted to feel as deeply as she could. She wanted me to feel as deeply as she felt. And in that way, I think it was almost unhealthy in terms of what she wanted our relationship to be. I had some friends who were psychiatrists, and they said that my mother had almost like a borderline personality. Now, I don't exactly understand what that means, except that what I took from it is that my mother didn't have a border between her personality and her emotions and mine. She wanted both of us to merge our emotions, meaning my emotions had to be her emotions, and anything she felt, I had to feel as poignantly, as deeply, as painfully as she felt it. Now that is the quality of fiction. That what you're trying to do is imbue all of that in a character. And so you, the writer, are capturing that. It made my mother an ideal subject in that way, because, she was all about emotion and revealing all of her emotions. And what she felt at the time was what she felt in the moment, telling me about it. She was like somebody who had PTSD and reenacted what was going on that led to this. So I think in that way, she was different from not just a Chinese mother, but mothers in general, people in general.
But when you project something or you expect your child to share your feelings or to fulfill the dreams that you failed to fulfill, I mean, that's an incredibly powerful sort of set of molds to fall into. Whereas if you're just writing it in fiction, you're free to do whatever you want, and nobody kind of gets influenced for life. I wonder, I mean, and I know you grew up in this country, and you're sort of share bits and pieces of each side. But of course, China didn't have a Freud. It didn't have a framework for people to understand sort of inner emotions. That didn't mean they didn't have emotions. It just meant they had no way to sort of to view them or explain them. And I wonder if you thought that, that noticed that difference.
I definitely noticed that difference with people other than my mother, except for the fact that they had these secrets. But that may have also been because of my father. Once my father died, then a lot of the secrets came out, and a lot of her. It was like this pent up dam of emotions and stories came out as well. I think that also this tendency in our family to reveal emotions or to think about these things more deeply related also to my father being a minister. So he was also always questioning himself as in terms of his relationship to God. Was he sincere enough? Did he do things unselfishly? Was he being a minister and caring to people to receive a certain kind of gratitude from other people that was going to lead to self-aggrandizement? And so I had on both sides of me parents who were looking at almost in a way a personal philosophy of how they should conduct their lives. But in that sense, because, not every friend that I knew, or most people, didn't have a Chinese father who was a Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. Not everybody had a mother like mine who's, has had this trauma, who's left kids behind, had an abusive husband, his mother, and all of that. What was surprising to me is to find out from readers how much of that was in the background with family, these secrets, like the concubines, like the children left behind, or the husband left behind, the wife left behind without getting a divorce, et cetera, et cetera. And yet in these families, they didn't talk about them. They remained secrets for a very, very long time. And when they were mentioned, they were simply mentioned, and nobody went into great depth about them. And I'm not going to say which of my friends or family have those things in there. I just know that they don't touch it. It's there, but they don't get into it.
And what did your mother make of your father's Christian belief? Because, as you point out, a Christian belief is very antithetical to a lot of Chinese things, because it emphasizes the individual and the individual's relationship to God rather than to society or to various relationships with family and leaders and whatnot. Did she become Christian?
She became ostensibly Christian because she supported my father, in his profession. But, it's funny, my notion of Christianity, or at least the Baptist religion, is quite different from your take on it. I don't think of it as individual at all. At least that's not how I was raised with it. It was adherence to one set of beliefs. That's not individual. That maybe it's judging and assessing yourself in terms of your adherence to the beliefs. And it has to do with, the fear you might have if you don't adhere to them, or the reward you might get if you do. But there's not a lot of wiggle room, not in the religion I grew up with. You deviate and you have disobeyed God. My mother, on the other hand, was much more an individual, because she believed sort of in God, and she got a lot of support from the church, from the members there. But she also believed in karma. She believed in curses. She believed in ancestor worship. She had notions of feng shui, that what had happened in our family were possibly the result of imbalance in the house that we lived in. She hired a feng shui master to go doing an assessment. I never knew any of these things were part of her thinking until after my father died. What my mother did with those beliefs was cast out to see which one worked to get what she wanted, and which one would explain why things went wrong. And it wouldn't always be the same. This was punishment from, this was karma punishment. This was God could deliver a miracle, or maybe if you solved the feng shui imbalance, you could solve the curse. So she was very individual. It was her own philosophy, religion, spirituality, about things. And I think that really was more of an influence on me than, the straight and narrow of my father's religion.
Do you think she was a lonely person?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely lonely. I think all of us are lonely if we feel that people don't understand us. We could be surrounded by people. And if you have sorrows or troubles or desires and no one knows about them, you intentionally have kept it from them, or you tried to communicate them and everybody gives you sort of a pat on the back and that's it, or I'm so sorry for you. And it doesn't go beyond that. You could end up being very lonely. I think that is one of the feelings I have. One of the compulsions as a writer is to try and create, to express these emotions. And the witness to that is the character, writing it out. It's almost, there's another entity there that I can pour this out to, and it doesn't feel so lonely. But my mother didn't have that ability to put it down and use that as a sounding board to her emotions. So over time, starting when I was a child, she tried to have me be the person who would understand why she felt the way she did. And of course, as a child, you can't possibly understand, especially when you don't know the background to all of those feelings. It was a constant loneliness in her life that I became much more aware of as I got older. And even during the making of the documentary, there was a video that was recovered of my mother in 1970 after my father died. And when I was in college, I was away from home. She was by herself. She was at a picnic with a bunch of people, and there was a video. And I saw her standing alone and smiling big, trying to talk to people, and people talking past her. And I felt so bad when I saw that video. I started to cry because I could see how lonely she was, how nobody really understood how sad she was by what had happened. Life went on normally for other people. And she was bereft. She was a widow and she'd lost her son. And nobody knew that she was in deep, deep pain.
For the fourth consecutive year, Asia Society will host conversations honoring Asian filmmakers and talent at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival. The virtual panel discussions will take place on Tuesday, January 25th from 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific and will feature directors, screenwriters, and producers from films like Free Chol Soo Lee, Midwives, After Yang, and more. Film producer and Asia Society Advisory Board member Janet Yang will moderate these discussions. Learn more about how to stream the free event at asiasociety.org/Sundance. That's asiasociety.org/Sundance. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Do you think, Amy, when you finally started to write, and then sort of was using that as to mine your own experience, family's experience in your writing, do you think that helped her and opened her up and got her feeling more listened to and understood?
Oh, yeah. She was so happy. She read the Joy Luck Club. Well, first, it began when I started asking her more questions. And I knew some of the stories already because she told me 1,000 times. But now I really wanted to listen to them. And I say, tell me about the time that, who this bad man was. And she really had this pride now in talking to me. It wasn't simply lamenting and crying and feeling angry that no one understood her. She did it with a sense of pride that she was helping me. And sometimes she'd call me up and she'd want to now I forgot to tell you. And she'd go on and on for another, couple of hours. And at some point I had to let her know I didn't have time to listen because I had another job and I had to do some work as well. But this time when I said I was busy and I would have to listen later, she didn't become hysterical and say she was going to kill herself. She said, yes, you're busy. Go ahead, get your work done. We can talk later. When she read the book before it came out, she was so proud. She was so touched because she could tell that I understood her. One of her comments at the end that was the ultimate was that it was so easy to read. And one of the indications that she gave me that she knew now that I understood her very much was when she started to tell me another story about the same woman who had, insulted her or lied to her or whatever. She stopped herself and said, oh, I don't need to tell you. You understand. You're just like me. And that came out of her reading the book and knowing that I understood her. Now, she more than anyone knew that the book was fiction, and she could have told people, no, that story really didn't happen. This didn't happen. But the emotional parts of it and the kind of conflicts were true, and she recognized those, and that was important. I think that she was upset every now and then that people didn't give me more credit for being able to, that these stories were invented to a large degree, even though there were some stories that were really pretty much derived straight from the stories she told me. But many of the stories she could, she said, no, those never happened. Like the Chinese chess player, the girl who was the Chinese chess champion. I didn't play chess, that never happened. Or the girl in China who escaped her arranged marriage, that was a completely made up story. But the emotions within there, the story about the woman who got out of her marriage, the idea that you had to be to survive by your wits and never give up who you were, no matter what kind of light was thrust on you, to never allow yourself to become subservient to somebody else. That was a big theme in her life. Never let anybody tell you who you are.
What other writers of fiction do you think have had similar experiences where their works have not only been things that they've imagined or want to say, but are so deeply involved with family to the degree that it actually transforms the relationship of people in the family? Does anyone occur to you?
I probably, if I thought about it, a lot, I could probably tell you a bunch of a number of writers. I imagine that Louise Erdrich's life, her family life, and that her family stories and the events in her family has contributed a great deal to what she writes about. The situations and even portions of the story or the type of character she has in there. I will say that, it doesn't always lead to rapprochement in families.
Well, I was going to say that.
People, exactly. Yeah, I know of a number of people who've written memoir, and that did not at all lead to that. It led to a greater divide, as a matter of fact. People disputing the memory, people being furious that something about them, some family secret had been revealed. I know of some also who have used family history and where family member, especially like a spouse, is threatened to sue. So But I think you're referring to, childhood and writing about that lead to some kind of greater understanding and deepening of relationship. I'm sure there are many examples of that. I just can't think of them right now.
Yeah. So here's an audience question. Let's do a few questions. Did the documentary turn out differently to what you had envisioned at the beginning, or did it find its own course as it went?
I really didn't envision much of this, what it would turn out to be. This was not I was just the subject. So, it was really in the hands of Jamie Redford, the director, to develop. And I have to be honest that part of me thought this would never get made. People have these ideas. They're going to make a movie about something, and a lot of ways it's pie in the sky. Yeah, you want to make a movie about me. I said to Jamie, I'm not that famous. I don't know how you're going to sell this to somebody. And he said, he talked about American Masters. And I thought, well, American Masters is about, I don't know, some super, super famous person. And so I thought it was a little bit pie in the sky. And then there was also Jamie's health. And I thought, Jamie may not live long enough to finish this. So I didn't really have it in my mind, like some great anticipation of what this film was going to be. I will say, however, that when I finally saw it, I was so overwhelmed with how well he had knit together a story of my life. He could have taken it from any angle. He could have taken it simply from the writer angle or going from, or the Chinese American angle, the immigrant angle. And he had done something that encapsulated a lot of all of those things, but really focused on the relationship of my mother and enabling me and many people, I think, to see that was the crux of all of it. And he had captured that so beautifully. He revealed to me a number of things that that would seem so very obvious. One of them being things I never would have chosen to be shown. And I think it was 3 instances where he had me playing the piano. Now, I'm somebody who never plays piano in front of anybody because I have this big trauma. I hate it. I won't even play in front of Lou. I do have pianos. I have 2 grand pianos, but I will play only for myself. And he chose these videos, and I'm rushing through the pieces. I'm playing so fast. I'm making all these mistakes. But in the video, he chose, you see my mother watching, and she's beaming away. She is so proud. Her heart is busting with pride. And I saw that, and I thought, oh my God, I did make her happy with my music. I wasn't entirely a failure, so the movie was surprising to me as well.
I remember you saying in a little conversation we had with Yo-Yo Ma, and you, me, and him, since we all have spouses of the other race.
Yeah, the other race.
You were saying something like, my mother always insisted that I be like Yo-Yo Ma and play the piano.
Well, not Yo-Yo Ma. At that time, we didn't know who Yo-Yo Ma was, but it would have been, like Van Cliburn, or this certain boy and this certain family friend's son who played really well and, didn't have to look at the music and was so engaged, loved the music. And you could see, he was closing his eyes and so passionate. And yeah, what I said though was, had my mother been around when if Yo-Yo had gone to the same high school, she would have been saying, why can't you be like Yo-Yo Ma? And then later, if being older, she would say, why can't you, marry somebody to like Yo-Yo Ma? And what I said to Yo-Yo at that conference or something like, I would never have dated you. You know, I mean, you've been the bane of my life, you know, the cause of a lot of misery in my life. Yo-Yo just smiled and said, well, I would have dated you. Such a gentleman, you know.
Do you think that you have resolved in your life the sort of divide between being a Chinese immigrant and being here in America? And do you think your writing helped you when you went back to China and became, you know, more acquainted with that? Do you feel that's a fault line still?
I don't know if I would call it a fault line or a divide. I would call it a big gap of mystery. And I hope it never closes. I mean, if it closes, then I'm lying to myself that I've resolved something. I think that is the reason to write and to keep going. It's like looking in my backyard and you see all these birds and you think, oh, I know these birds. I know what that bird is, what that bird is. You know, you don't really know the birds. You don't know the bird's behavior or what it's thinking. You're not a bird. You can't possibly know. You have to keep asking questions. Same thing with being, you know, an American. You can't possibly understand completely what it means to be an American unless you're subjected to many, many situations ongoingly and how you feel about being an American. You're a different kind of American in a different country or a different circumstance, or when your fortunes rise or fall. And the same thing, you know, being Chinese and having your family come from another country just increases the complexity of the questions, the mystery, and the wonder that you have over this gap of wondering, this gap that you don't understand. You know, you don't know how deep it is. You don't know how wide it is or how it got started. But if you're a writer or you have the motivation, you want to dive in. It's a little scary, but you want to dive in and pick things out and understand more and more. So yes, I think I will always have the divide. I will always have this gap of understanding, and I acknowledge it. I welcome it. I don't ignore it. You know, it fuels me. It nurtures me. The big mystery, the ignorance. You know, I just have to remember to ask more and more questions. The answers are not as interesting as the questions are.
So here's someone who has a question. They want to know about the animation in the documentary. I think it was very effective. Yeah. How did you discern which elements of the documentary would be represented through animation?
Well, again, I didn't make the film, so I had nothing to do with choosing any of that. It was as much of a revelation to me as to the viewer. You know, I saw it for the first time when the film was complete. Actually, I take that back. When I was very hesitant about becoming the subject of this film, Jamie said, why don't you just let me create a test reel of 5 to 10 minutes? And if you don't like it, that's fine. Just tell me and I'll go away. And that'll be the end of it. Well, he wouldn't go away. We were friends, but he would not bring the subject up. If I had any issues with it or questions, then we could explore that. If I liked it, it would be great. So I saw one example of the animation, which I thought was just terrific. And the rest of it, I had to wait until the film was done to see what he had done. It is kind of odd when I get people who compliment me on the film. You did it, you know, it was a great film. You did a great job. And I always have to remind them, you know, I was material. I was the subject. It really was the artistry of the documentary team, of Jamie Redford, of the, you know, Suzanne DeBrunner, of Karen Pritzker and her vision, of the sound engineer, Bob Edwards, of Jeff Boyette, the editor, Catherine Bostick, the music composer, you know, who really captured the soul of what was going on. I felt her music so deeply. I had no idea this was going to come about in that way. they are the people who made this film, and they are the ones who, made those choices. If you like the movie, if you like the choices of the animation, the music, and the parts that were put in there, then you have to credit the documentary team. We had a party this weekend with the team. It was our first time of all of us getting together. It was the delayed wrap party held here in this room that you see. And we said, for those segments of what you see me talking about in the living room, he said there were like hours and hours that was taken from. And he said, we have those reels. And they said, we should just give it to you because, they were talking about all the choices, why they would choose this, but why they had to leave this out, how difficult it was for them to ignore this in order to have a narrative, that would make any sense. And we also agreed to do something. My suggestion was we'd have another wrap party. And this time we would sit down and watch the film together. And we would all talk about what went on in the decisions at each moment of that. I could recall then what I was feeling and talking about it, during the part that they were showing. But they would say, yeah, when we did the cut there, or when we did this, or some of the funny problems they had that they had to solve, we would be able to sit down and talk about that. And I thought that would be fun. We're going to record that for ourselves and see, have a history, a documentary for ourselves of how the documentary was made.
Perhaps our viewers would want to know, but sadly, Jamie Redford died sometime after making your film, which is an enormous shame. Here's a question which one wonders, who is your favorite character, and is it difficult to leave the characters behind once a book is finished, or do they continue to remain with you and shape your subsequent writing like family memories?
You mean character from all my books, or?
Well, from whatever books. I mean, do these characters live on with you? I think he or she is asking.
Oh.
Or can you just move on to the next group?
It's a really difficult question because I don't think of my characters in the same way that others do. They exist in stories, but who those characters are made of are real people, or real thoughts that are part of me. I mean, they will always be part of me. So no, I don't ever leave them behind because they're in me. But one character that I love to bring out in the open, I sound like Three Faces of Eve or something, I have these characters in me, and then I let, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a little girl now, reenacting my, it's the character Lindo, who is in the Joy Luck Club, and she's a mother with a, very fierce way of coming out with advice. She's the one whose daughter was Waverly, the chess champion, and Waverly was very arrogant and self-assured at times, and Lindo could just cut her down to a millimeter, just with a single look or a word. And that was a lot like my mother, but I also can see these things in myself. Not that I would do it quite the same way, but the nature of how she would say things that would cut to the bone or cut to the chase at what was there, and then just sit there very matter of fact that, what do you mean? Why are you getting upset? I'm just telling the truth. So a Linda line that I use a lot is, going on and on about something that is actually rather critical, and then saying, this is my thinking, which is what Lindo says in the book and also in the movie. And that kind of diffuses everything, when we're when Lou and I are talking about a situation, not arguing with each other, but talking about a situation in front of us, and we'll go on, and then I'll just lighten it up and say, this is my thinking. So she's always, all the characters are with me in some way or the other.
Well, everybody's relation to their parents is paramount in their lives, and then when it gets overlaid with some sort of cultural differences, which it often is, even for people who aren't immigrants, it becomes all the more interesting. And and I think this film, Amy, is a kind of a very interesting reminder of how real life affects fiction, but then fiction affects real life. And sometimes in the writing of it, the people
absolutely
use you get catalyzed into a different. And I think your fiction has done that miraculously well. Partially because it's an immigrant experience, so you have a whole bunch of people who are very curious to see how someone else threaded that needle. But
I mean, you Bai Fong, she's Chinese, and I don't know if we have had this very long friendship, and it has always included Bai Fong, your wife, and it's. The loss of her is so deeply felt, but it made me wonder also, she had such an interesting life in China when she was growing up. And I wondered, did your sons, were they able to ask or video her history to keep with them? Her history is so powerful. She became this very powerful person.
I think they did learn a lot. There were certain things she didn't reveal. But then, of course, her parents lived with us for 20 years. And so that was a whole other source of access. And it made...
Access, or, we don't want to hear it anymore.
I mean, all of those things go into these complex familial connections. Exactly. But it was wonderful, I think, that they were here, because the kids got more sense of where their mother came from, and also where their grandparents came from, and a whole lot of Chinese history.
That'll do it for this week's episode of Asia in Depth. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, and check out past episodes by visiting our show page at asiasociety.org/podcast. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Asia Society. I'm Michelle Florcruz. See you next time.